It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at the city's most exclusive cafe, jazz playing softly, the smell of roasted coffee beans, the rhythm of rain drumming against the high glass windows. Then the bell chimed, shivering under the storm. A weary woman stepped inside, shaking a wet umbrella, shielding a little girl whose coat was too thin for the weather, whose small hands clutched a damp handwritten note. The mother's posture was stiff, the kind of dignity a person holds on to when they have lost everything else. They stood dripping on the polished marble floor, staring at the glass case, velvet cakes, warm pastries, comfort they couldn't afford. The girl looked up and whispered, "Mom, can we stay just a minute?" The mother swallowed hard, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. She leaned toward the manager behind the counter, her voice trembling so low only the nearest souls could hear. "Could we just have a cup of hot water? Please. We can't buy anything, but it's her first birthday without her father." The manager sneered. Nearby, a couple shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but someone else heard it too. Seated in a velvet booth, a porcelain espresso cup paused halfway to his lips, was Han Ji-hoon, the sharpest suit in the room, the most dangerous man in the city. He saw the way the little girl clutched her letter to her chest. He saw the mother bracing herself for the blow, and he heard that sentence land heavier than a judge's gavel. The manager sighed loudly. "Look, this isn't a charity, lady. You're loitering. You need to get out." The girl's lip quivered. The mother blinked fast, humiliation flushing her cheeks. Han slowly lowered his cup. The sharp clink of china against the saucer cut through the noise like a gunshot. The entire cafe went dead silent. He stood up, towering in his dark suit, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning. He walked over, the sound of his polished shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep, terrifyingly calm. The mother turned, eyes widening in panic. She recognized the aura of violence around him, but instead of coldness, she saw a crack in his armor, a look of surprised, conflicted pain. He ignored the pale-faced manager and knelt on one knee before the little girl. He looked at her tear-filled eyes, the note in her hand, and asked gently, "Tell me, little one, which one of these cakes is your favorite?" What happened next would act as the signal for a war that would change all three of their lives forever. Welcome back to the gallery. Stay with me till the end. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe, comment where you're watching from, and you're absolutely amazing. Let's get into the story. The little girl's name was Lila. She turned 7 today, though the grief in her eyes made her look much older. Losing a parent has a way of dimming a child's light, replacing loud laughter with quiet observation. Her mother, Tasha, had been struggling to keep them afloat for 6 months since the accident that took her husband. They had walked 12 blocks in the rain because Tasha couldn't afford a cab, just to see something beautiful on a day that felt so ugly. Lila pointed to a strawberry shortcake topped with fresh cream. "That one," she whispered, clutching her note tighter. "But the water is okay, Mommy." Han Ji-hoon had built his empire on silence and precision. He was the head of the syndicate, a man who controlled the city's shadows and had long ago decided that emotions were liabilities. He was known as the Ghost because by the time you saw him, you were already gone. But as he looked down at this 7-year-old girl clutching a letter to a dead father, the ice around his heart shattered. The manager, a man named Miller who prided himself on keeping the riffraff out, shifted nervously. He recognized the suit, the watch, the tattoo on the hand. He knew who Han was. His throat went dry. "Mr. Han, I'm sorry, but we have a policy against non-paying customers."
Han's dark eyes moved from Lila to the manager, a look so cold it dropped the temperature in the room. The other patrons stopped eating. Even the rain outside seemed to fade into the background.
Minutes earlier, the warmth of the cafe, smelling of roasted hazelnut and expensive perfume, felt like a barrier Tasha Coleman wasn't supposed to cross. She stood near the entrance, water pooling around her worn sneakers, trying to make herself and her daughter invisible against the mahogany paneling. But invisibility was impossible when you were poor in a place designed for the wealthy. Mr. Miller, the manager, didn't just walk over, he marched. He was a man who wore his authority like a tight vest, eager to prove he guarded the gate. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to intimidate, but far enough to avoid the damp chill radiating from their clothes. "Excuse me," Miller said, his voice pitched intentionally loud, cutting through the low murmur of jazz and polite conversation. "I thought I made myself clear when you walked in." Tasha tightened her grip on Lila's shoulder, pulling the 7-year-old closer to her side. Lila was small for her age, drowning in a hand-me-down coat that had seen better winters. In her hand, she clutched a piece of lined notebook paper, folded into a tight square, damp at the edges. "We just wanted to dry off for a moment, sir," Tasha said, keeping her voice low, a desperate attempt to contain the scene. "The rain came down so fast. We're not asking for food." "This is a business, not a public shelter," Miller snapped. He gestured theatrically to the room of patrons, women in cashmere sweaters and men in tailored suits, who were now watching the spectacle with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "These people are paying for an atmosphere." "You are disrupting it. You're dripping dirty water on my marble floors." Tasha felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burning shame that pricked at her eyes. She was a woman who had once hosted dinner parties, who had laughed in kitchens just like this one before the factory accident took her husband and the medical bills took the rest. "Please," she whispered, her pride fracturing. "It's my daughter's birthday. We don't have anywhere else to go right now. Just 5 minutes." Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. "And I suppose that's my problem? If you can't afford a cup of coffee, you can't afford to be here. Loitering is loitering." Lila looked up, her large, dark eyes shifting from the angry man to her mother's trembling chin. She sensed the danger, the rejection. Her grip on the folded note tightened until her knuckles turned white. It was the letter she had written that morning, addressed to Daddy in the Stars, asking him if he could see her from up there, if he knew she was 7 now. She had wanted to read it somewhere nice, somewhere that felt special, not under a leaking bus stop. "Mommy?" Lila whispered, her voice cracking. "Let's go. It's okay." "You heard the girl," Miller said, crossing his arms. "Out. Now, before I call security and have you escorted out like trash." The word hung in the air. Trash. Tears welled in Lila's eyes, spilling over her lashes before she could blink them away. She looked down at her wet shoes, shrinking into herself, wishing she could disappear entirely. The cruelty wasn't just in the refusal, it was in the volume, the public performance of their worthlessness. Tasha bit her lip so hard she tasted copper, the metallic tang of helpless rage. She turned to the door, defeated, her hand trembling as she reached for the brass handle. The brass handle was cold under Tasha's hand, but before she could push the heavy door open, a sharp, deliberate sound cut through the humidity of the cafe. Clink. It was the sound of fine china hitting a saucer, not with the carelessness of a finished meal, but with the calculated precision of a gavel striking a judge's bench. The noise was small, yet it seemed to sever the ambient hum of the room. The jazz music felt distant suddenly. The murmur of conversations died out like a snuffed candle. Han Ji-hoon removed his hand from the small espresso cup. He sat in the corner booth, a shadow among the velvet upholstery, his stillness more terrifying than any shout. He didn't look at the manager. He didn't look at Tasha. He looked at his own reflection in the darkened window, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit jacket, where a sliver of ink, a black viper winding around his wrist, was just barely visible. Slowly, fluidly, he rose to his full height. The air in the room shifted. It became heavier, charged with static. The patrons who had been snickering only moments ago now averted their gazes, staring intently at their scones and tea, suddenly terrified of making eye contact. They knew that suit. They knew the way he carried himself, like a wolf walking through a pen of sheep. Hans stepped out of the booth. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, his movements graceful and predatory. He began to walk toward the counter. Click, click, click. His polished Oxfords struck the marble floor with a rhythmic, hollow cadence that echoed in the silence. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying patience of a man who owned every second of time in the room. Miller, the manager, felt his smirk falter. He blinked, squinting past the glare of the overhead lights, annoyance transforming into confusion, and then, as the figure drew closer, into a cold, paralyzing recognition. The blood drained from Miller's face so fast it left him looking gray. He took an involuntary step back, his spine colliding with the espresso machine behind him. Tasha froze, her hand still on the door. She felt the shift in power, a physical wave of pressure rolling off the man approaching them. He was beautiful in a severe, terrifying way, his face composed of sharp angles and cold indifference. But his eyes, dark and abyssal, were fixed on Miller with an intensity that promised ruin. Hans stopped at the counter. He towered over the trembling manager, blocking out the light, his shadow stretching long and dark over the display of pastries. He said nothing. He simply stood there, an immovable object, letting the silence stretch until it was suffocating, waiting for Miller to realize the gravity of his mistake. The silence in the cafe was so absolute that the hum of the refrigerated display case sounded like a roar. Han Ji-hoon didn't look at Miller. He didn't acknowledge the manager's frantic, shallow breathing or the way the man's hands were trembling as they gripped the edge of the counter. To Han, the manager had already ceased to exist as anything more than an obstacle. With a fluid motion that defied his intimidating stature, Han turned away from the counter and knelt. One knee touched the damp marble floor, heedless of the expensive fabric of his trousers. He was now eye level with Lila. The little girl pulled back instinctively, her fingers tightening around the damp note in her hand, but she didn't run. There was something in Han's face, a flicker of something raw and deeply buried that kept her rooted to the spot. Up close, the ghost of the city didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man haunted by a ghost of his own. "Which one is your favorite?" he asked. His voice was no longer the cold blade he had used to silence the room. It was low, roughened by a gentleness that seemed foreign even to his own lips. Lila's gaze drifted past him to the glass case, then back to his dark, steady eyes. She pointed a small, shaking finger at the strawberry shortcake, the one with the fresh cream that looked like fallen snow. "That one," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "The strawberry one." Han nodded slowly, as if she had just given him the most vital piece of intelligence in the world. He stood up, the transformation back into the apex predator instantaneous. He reached into his silk-lined pocket and pulled out a matte black card, placing it on the counter with a sharp snap. "Every cake in that case," Han said, his eyes finally moving to Miller. The manager looked as though he might collapse. "Every pastry, every sandwich, pack them all, now." Miller fumbled for the card, his voice a pathetic squeak. "All of them, Mr. Han? That's hundreds of dollars." "I don't recall asking for a quote,"
Han replied, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing the manager whole. And before you touch a single box, you are going to look at this mother and her daughter. You are going to apologize for every word you spoke, and you are going to make it sincere, or I will ensure you never have the opportunity to speak in this city again. The manager's knees buckled. He looked at Tasha, who stood frozen in a state of shock, and then at Lila, who was watching him with wide, wet eyes. I'm so sorry, Miller stammered, his voice thick with genuine terror. I was wrong. Please accept my deepest apologies. It's an honor to have you here today. Han didn't wait for Tasha to respond. He simply pointed at the strawberry cake. Start with that one. It's her birthday.
The cafe was a flurry of terrified efficiency. Miller moved with a frantic speed, his hands fumbling as he slid premium cakes and delicate pastries into gold-embossed boxes. The clatter of the bakery boxes was the only sound in the room, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain outside. At a small table nearby, Lila sat with the strawberry shortcake in front of her. She took a tiny, hesitant bite, the sweetness of the cream bringing a fragile smile to her face, a smile that looked out of place against her tear-stained cheeks. Tasha sat beside her, her hand resting on Lila's arm, her eyes fixed on Han Ji-hoon. She looked like a woman who had just been pulled from a shipwreck, still gasping for air, unable to decide if her savior was a man or a different kind of storm. Han didn't sit. He stood with his back to the room, his gaze seemingly fixed on the rain-streaked window. To any observer, he was merely a man waiting for his order, but his mind was a finely tuned instrument, scanning the perimeter. Then he saw it. In the dark reflection of the window, through the blur of water running down the glass, a figure stood across the street. A man in a heavy nylon jacket was leaning against a lamppost, the orange glow of the light catching the side of his throat. There, winding up from under his collar toward his ear, was the unmistakable ink of a coiled serpent, the mark of the black vipers. The man wasn't looking at the cafe's signage. He was staring directly at Han. Then his eyes shifted toward the back of Tasha's head. A cold, familiar weight settled in Han's gut. The vipers had been hunting him for weeks, looking for a crack in his armor, a moment of uncharacteristic weakness to exploit. By stepping out of the shadows to defend this woman, by kneeling before this child in a room full of witnesses, he had handed his enemies exactly what they needed, a target that wasn't him. The warmth he had felt just moments ago, the strange, flickering light in his chest, was instantly extinguished by a wave of icy reality. He realized with a sickening clarity that he hadn't just saved them from a cruel manager, he had walked them directly into the center of a war zone. His presence was poison, and by touching their lives, he had likely signed their death warrants. The ghost of the city felt his hand instinctively drift toward the concealed holster beneath his jacket. He didn't look back at the window, he didn't blink, he simply watched the reflection as the man with the snake tattoo raised a phone to his ear. The birthday was no longer a celebration, it was a countdown. "Pack it faster," Han said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration that made Miller nearly drop a box of macarons. He didn't look at Tasha, but his tone was urgent, a command that brooked no argument. "We're leaving. Now." Miller finished piling the gold-embossed boxes into 2 large, heavy bags, his movements jerky and frantic. He slid them across the marble counter as if they were live explosives. Tasha reached for them, her hands trembling, but Han's hand intercepted hers. His fingers didn't touch her skin, yet she could feel the heat radiating from his palm, a silent, immovable command. "I'll carry these," Han said. His voice was no longer the gentle rasp he had used with Lila. It was the cold, efficient tone of a man calculating a trajectory. He looked at Tasha, his gaze piercing through her fatigue. "My car is outside. I'm driving you home." Tasha pulled back slightly, her posture stiffening. That's not necessary, Mr. Han. You've already done more than enough. We live just 12 blocks away. We can walk once the rain lets up." Han didn't blink. He didn't even look at the rain. His eyes remained fixed on the reflection in the glass, where the man with the snake tattoo was now turning to signal someone further down the street. "The rain isn't going to let up," Han said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. "And you aren't walking." "I don't even know who you are," Tasha whispered, her protective instincts flaring even through her exhaustion. "You know exactly who I am," Han applied. He stepped closer, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire entryway. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his authority made the air feel thin. "Right now, your safety is tied to mine. By accepting that cake, you became a variable in a very dangerous equation. If you walk out that door alone, you won't make it to the end of the block." Tasha looked at Lila, who was clutching her handwritten note to her chest, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and burgeoning fear. Tasha saw the truth in Han's eyes, a dark, jagged reality that she had spent years trying to keep away from her daughter. She realized this wasn't an offer of a ride, it was an extraction. "Okay," she breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. Han nodded once. He grabbed the bags in one hand and placed his other hand firmly on the small of Tasha's back, guiding her toward the exit. "Stay close to me. Do not look at the street. Look at the car." As they stepped out, the cold rain lashed at them instantly, but the black, armored sedan was already idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl. A driver in a dark suit stood by the rear door, his hand resting near his waistband. Han shielded Lila with his coat as they hurried across the sidewalk. The heavy door opened with a muffled thud, revealing an interior of plush leather and darkened glass. As Tasha and Lila climbed inside, the world outside, the rain, the manager, and the man with the snake tattoo suddenly felt 1,000 miles away. The door closed, sealing them into a tomb-like silence that smelled of expensive cedar and gun oil. The interior of the sedan was a silent sanctuary of leather and shadows, the only sound the muffled rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers against the glass. Layla sat between the two adults, her small hands still protective over the gold-embossed cake box, her eyes wide as she watched the city lights blur into streaks of neon gold and red. Han didn't lean back. His body was a coiled spring, his eyes darting from the side view mirror to the digital heads-up display on the dashboard. 2 cars back, a silver SUV had followed them through 3 consecutive illogical turns. It didn't have its high beams on, but the way it maintained a precise distance, never gaining, never falling behind, told Han everything he needed to know. The Vipers weren't just watching, they were hunting. "Change of plans," Han said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum through the car's frame. He didn't look at the driver, but the man behind the wheel nodded instantly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. "Avoid the residential district, head for the heights." Tasha straightened, her hand instinctively finding Layla's. She looked out the tinted window, her brow furrowing as the familiar route to their modest apartment disappeared behind them. "This isn't the way," she whispered, her voice tight with a new kind of panic. "Mr. Han, our home is back toward the docks. Where are you taking us?" Han finally turned his head. The passing street lamps cast flickering shadows across his sharp features, making him look like a statue carved from obsidian. He saw the sheer exhaustion in Tasha's eyes, the way she was bracing herself for another tragedy. "Your home is no longer a safe place," Han said. He kept his voice steady, anchored by a certainty that, "Because you helped us?" "Because I allowed myself to be seen," Han corrected softly. He looked down at Lila, who was looking up at him with a fragile smile, unaware that her birthday wish had just placed her in the crosshairs of a syndicate. "Bad men are watching us, but they cannot follow where we are going. You are safe with me." The car swerved sharply, turning into a narrow private road lined with high stone walls and security cameras that pivoted as they passed. They were climbing away from the city, leaving the noise and the filth behind for a secluded safe house perched on the cliffs. Tasha didn't argue. She saw the silver SUV disappear in the distance as they passed through a heavy iron gate that hissed shut behind them. For the first time in 6 months, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, even as she realized that her life, and Lila's, would never be the same again. The safe house was a fortress of glass and cold stone, perched on a cliffside where the rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and floor wax, silent save for the hum of the high-end security system. Tasha sat on the edge of a vast velvet sofa, her hands still trembling as she watched the monitors displaying the empty, rain-slicked driveway. She looked out of place, a woman of grit and survival suddenly dropped into a world where even the air felt expensive. Han Ji-hoon stood by the fireplace, his back to them. He had removed his jacket, revealing the stark white of his shirt and the dark holsters strapped to his shoulders. He was a man built for war, his movements focused on the digital maps and camera feeds on his phone. A small tug at his sleeve made him freeze. He turned to find Lila standing there. She had finally let go of the gold-embossed cake box, but she was still holding the damp, folded piece of notebook paper. Her eyes, large and shimmering with the remnants of her tears, were fixed on his. "You're the man from the coffee shop," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread in the large room. "I am," Han replied, his voice instinctively softening. "My mommy says you're helping us." She held out the paper. The edges were frayed and the ink had bled slightly from the rain, but the handwriting was neat, the careful, looping letters of a child. "I wrote this for my daddy this morning. It's his birthday gift." Han hesitated. His hands, scarred from decades of pulling triggers and clenching fists, felt too heavy, too clumsy to touch something so fragile. But he reached out and took it. "Dear Daddy," the note began, "I am 7 today. We miss you every single minute. Mommy cries when she thinks I'm asleep, and the house is very cold now. I don't want toys or a party. I just want you to send us an angel to watch over Mommy so she isn't tired anymore. Please, Daddy, just one angel." The silence in the room suddenly became deafening. Han felt a sharp, jagged pain in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 30 years. He looked from the paper to the small, hopeful face of the girl standing before him. He was no angel. He was a man of the shadows, a dealer in violence, the very kind of bad man he had warned her about. Yet, as Lila reached out and tentatively touched the scar on his hand, her fragile smile radiating a terrifying amount of trust, Han felt the iron walls around his heart crumble. His breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, the cold, calculated ghost of the city vanished, leaving behind a man who finally understood what he had been fighting for all his life. "I think your daddy heard you," Han managed to say, his voice thick and unrecognizable. He folded the note with trembling fingers and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "I'm going to make sure no one ever makes your mommy cry again." The red light on the security panel began to pulse, a silent heartbeat of impending violence. Outside, the rhythmic lashing of the rain was suddenly punctuated by the sharp crunch of gravel and the heavy thud of car doors. Han didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The man who had just tucked a child's letter over his heart vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal, calculating phantom that ruled the city's underworld. "Get up," Han commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a closing tomb. Tasha gasped, pulling Lila against her chest as the first window shattered downstairs. The sound of the black vipers breaching the perimeter echoed through the stone halls. Han moved with a speed that was almost inhuman, grabbing a hidden latch behind a mahogany bookshelf. A section of the wall hissed open, revealing a small, steel-lined room lit by a dim amber glow. "In, now," he said, ushering them inside. "Are you coming?" Lila whispered, her small face pale with terror, her eyes searching for the man she had just called an angel. Han paused, his hand resting on the heavy steel door. He looked at her, and for a split second, the coldness in his dark eyes flickered with a raw, protective heat. He reached into his breast pocket, feeling the crinkle of her letter against his chest. "I have to finish the wish, Lila," he said softly. "Do not open this door for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Tasha nodded, her gaze fixed on him with a terrifying realization of who he truly was, and why she needed him to be that man. As the door sealed shut with a heavy mechanical click, Han turned back to the dark hallway. The first of the vipers appeared at the top of the stairs, the snake tattoo on his neck visible even in the dim light. He held a silenced weapon, but he never got the chance to raise it. Han didn't move like a man, he moved like a shadow, a blur of white linen and dark intent. The violence that followed was silent, surgical, and absolute. Han Ji-hoon didn't fight to survive, he fought to erase. Every strike was a promise kept to a dead father and a little girl under his protection. In the darkness of the safe house, the ghost unleashed a fury the vipers had never seen. A man with everything to lose is dangerous, but a man who has just found a reason to live is invincible. The hallway was soon painted in shades of red, the silence returning only when the last of the intruders had fallen. Han stood alone in the hallway, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on the door where the only pieces of light left in his world were hiding. The thunder of gunfire had been replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Outside, the wail of sirens began to bleed into the night, a distant, rhythmic promise of order finally arriving to the chaos. Han Ji-hoon stood in the center of the shattered hallway, his white shirt no longer pristine, stained with the dark, jagged evidence of the price he had paid to keep the house standing. He took a ragged breath, the adrenaline beginning to recede, and leaving behind the dull ache of a dozen bruises. He wiped a smudge of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand, the same hand that had held a child's birthday wish just an hour ago. He didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked like a man who had clawed his way back from the edge of the abyss. He walked to the bookshelf, his fingers finding the hidden latch. The mechanical hiss of the panic room door opening felt like the first real sound in a dead world. Inside, the amber light spilled out, illuminating Tasha and Lila. Tasha stood protectively in front of her daughter, her dark eyes wide and searching, her posture reflecting the quiet, steely resilience of a mother who had survived 1,000 smaller wars. When her gaze met Han's, her breath escaped in a sharp, shuddering sob of relief. But it was Lila who moved first. She didn't look at the carnage in the hallway. She didn't shrink away from the red stains on Han's sleeves or the terrifying intensity still lingering in his sharp Korean features. She didn't see a monster. She saw the man who had knelt for her. She saw the answer to the letter she had written that morning. "You came back," she cried, her voice a burst of pure, fragile hope. She ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist, burying her face against his damp shirt. Han froze, his arms hovering for a moment, as if he feared he might break her, or that his stained hands might leave a mark she could never wash off. But as she held him, thankful and unfazed by the violence he carried, the last of the ice around his heart vanished. He slowly closed his arms around her, his large hand resting gently against the back of her head. Over the child's shoulder, he looked at Tasha. For the first time, Han smiled, a small, tired but genuine expression that finally reached his eyes. The war wasn't over, and the shadows would always be there. But as the police lights began to flash against the cliffside windows, Han knew he was no longer alone in the dark. He had been a protector by trade, but today he had become a guardian by choice. The garden was a riot of color, a hidden sanctuary of blooming jasmine and vibrant peonies, protected by a high stone wall that kept the noise of the city at bay. Sunlight filtered through the leaves of an ancient oak tree, dappling the grass where white chairs were arranged around a table laden with sweets. It was a world away from the rain-slicked cliffs and the cold, sterile shadows of the year before. At the center of it all was Lila. She wore a dress the color of clear summer skies, her hair tied with a bright ribbon that wasn't frayed or faded. Her laughter, once a rare and fragile thing, now rang out with a bell-like clarity as she chased a butterfly near the rose bushes. Tasha stood by the refreshments, her face fuller and the weary lines of survival replaced by the soft glow of peace. She moved with a dignity that was no longer a shield against the world, but a reflection of her own strength. A heavy iron gate at the edge of the garden opened with a soft click. Han Ji-hoon walked in, but he was nearly unrecognizable from the man who had once frozen a cafe with a single look. He wasn't wearing a suit. His charcoal jacket had been replaced by a soft linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the viper tattoo that now seemed less like a threat and more like a memory. He moved with the same rhythmic grace, but the predatory edge had been tempered into a quiet, steady presence. In his hands, he held a gift wrapped in gold paper, a heavy box that promised something far more substantial than a simple toy. "Uncle Han!" Lila squealed, abandoning her chase and sprinting across the grass. Han knelt, just as he had on that rainy afternoon, but this time it wasn't to face a manager or a monster. He caught her in a hug, his hardened heart now fully mended by the weight of her trust. He stood up, hoisting her onto his hip with an ease that spoke of many such afternoons spent in this garden. He met Tasha's gaze over the child's shoulder. There was no need for words. The shared understanding between them was the foundation of their new life. He would never replace the man they had lost, and he never tried to. He wasn't the father Lila had written to in her letter, but he was the guardian who had answered the call. As they gathered around the table to light the candles on a fresh, massive strawberry shortcake, the shadows of the past felt like a lifetime ago. Han looked at the two people who had given him a reason to step out of the dark, realizing that while he hadn't been born into this family, he had been chosen by it. He wasn't just a boss or a ghost anymore. He was home. This serves as a powerful testament to the truth that our past does not have to be our prologue. and that one singular moment of empathy can outweigh a lifetime of indifference. It reminds us that true strength is not found in the ability to instill fear or command empires, but in the courage to remain soft in a world that rewards the hard-hearted. We often walk through our lives blinded by our own shadows, believing that our scars define us, or that we are too far gone to matter. Yet this narrative proves that redemption is always just one choice away. It challenges us to look closer at the strangers in our periphery, the weary mother, the hopeful child, the man in the corner, and to recognize that every person is fighting a battle we know nothing about. When Han Ji-hoon lowered his cup, he didn't just save a birthday, he saved his own soul by choosing to be the angel someone else was praying for. Let this be your motivation. Never underestimate the ripple effect of a quiet act of kindness, for you never know when your decision to stand up for the vulnerable will be the very thing that finally sets you free. Your power is best measured by the lives you protect, the tears you dry, and the hope you restore in the hearts of those who thought the world had forgotten them. Thanks for watching.